Hey there, fellow explorers. So you think you've seen the world, right? You've scrolled through Instagram, watched a few travel vlogs, maybe even visited that one beach everyone keeps posting about. Cute. But here's the thing. Our planet has been hiding absolute bangers from you. We're talking caves so massive they have their own weather systems, beaches that glow like someone spilled radioactive Gatorade into the ocean, and forests so ancient they were already old when dinosaurs were still figuring out their dating lives. Today, we're going on a trip to places that look like they were designed by a video game developer who got a little too creative. Places where fire burns eternally from rocks, where sand dunes sit next to glaciers like they're just casually hanging out, and where jellyfish have completely forgotten how to sting. These spots aren't hiding in some parallel dimension. They're right here on Earth, and most humans will never see them with their own eyes. So before we dive in, smash that like button if you're into discovering places that make zero logical sense. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. I genuinely want to know, are you tuning in from a big city, a small town, or maybe somewhere that could end up on this list? Let's find out together. Ready to have your mind completely rearranged? Let's go. Now that we've established that Earth has been keeping secrets from us like a teenager with a diary, let's start our journey in the most logical place possible, underground. Because apparently the surface wasn't interesting enough for our planet. No. Earth decided to hollow itself out and create entire worlds beneath our feet, complete with their own weather systems, forests, and ecosystems that have never seen a single ray of sunlight. Welcome to the realm of caves, where the rules of the surface world simply do not apply. Let's begin with the absolute heavyweight champion of underground spaces, Son Doong Cave in Vietnam. Now, when I say this cave is big, I need you to recalibrate your entire understanding of what big means. Forget about that impressive basement your uncle is always bragging about. Son Doong is so monumentally massive that you could fit an entire Boeing 747 inside it and still have room for a parking lot. Actually, scratch that. You could fit about 40 747s stacked on top of each other and still have headroom. The main passage stretches over 5 kilometers long, reaches heights of 200 meters in places, and is so wide that you could comfortably host a football match inside with room for the spectators, the concession stands, and probably a small airport for good measure. But here's where things get genuinely surreal. Son Doong isn't just a big empty hole in the ground. At some point in the distant past, sections of the cave's ceiling decided they were tired of being a ceiling and simply collapsed. This created what are called dolines, essentially massive skylights that allow sunlight to pour into the cave. And what happens when you give a tropical environment access to water, soil, and sunshine? You get a jungle. Yes, there is a literal rainforest growing inside this cave. Trees reaching toward the distant ceiling, their own unique ecosystem of plants and animals that exist nowhere else on the planet, all thriving in what looks like a scene from a fantasy novel. Scientists have discovered species in here that have never been documented anywhere else, which makes sense because these creatures have been living in their own private underground paradise for millions of years, blissfully unaware that there's a whole other world up above, where people are busy inventing things like taxes and traffic jams. The cave was only discovered by the outside world in 1991, and even then, it took another 18 years before anyone actually explored it properly. A local farmer named Ho Khan stumbled upon the entrance while foraging in the jungle, heard the sound of rushing water and wind coming from a mysterious hole in the mountainside, and decided that was enough adventure for one day. Which, honestly, is a completely reasonable reaction. If you're walking through the forest and suddenly hear what sounds like the breathing of the earth itself coming from a dark opening, your survival instincts are absolutely right to suggest maybe not investigating that particular mystery. Ho Khan didn't return to explore until 2009, when he guided a team of British cavers to the entrance. What they found changed everything we thought we knew about caves. The exploration of Son Doong reads like something out of an adventure movie, except with more scientific equipment and fewer dramatic musical scores. The team had to navigate through passages that narrowed unexpectedly, swim through underground rivers with water so clear it looked like they were floating in liquid glass, and climb massive calcite formations that had been building up drop by drop for hundreds of thousands of years. They encountered cave pearls the size of baseballs, formed when mineral-rich water drips onto small grains of sand and slowly coats them layer by layer over millennia. Some of these pearls are so perfectly round and polished they look manufactured, which they technically are, just by the most patient craftsman imaginable, geological time. One of the most spectacular features inside Son Doong is a formation the explorers named the Great Wall of Vietnam, a calcite barrier nearly 90 meters tall that blocks further passage into the cave. Imagine a wall of flowstone that took millions of years to form, drop by drop, mineral deposit by mineral deposit, growing taller than a 25-story building. The only way past it was to climb, which the exploration team did, becoming the first humans in history to see what lay beyond. Not exactly your average weekend hiking trip. But Vietnam doesn't have a monopoly on mind-bending underground spaces. Let's travel to the Ural Mountains in Russia, where a cave called Sumgan Kutuk has been quietly existing for longer than human civilization, waiting for someone brave enough, or possibly foolish enough, to explore it. The name comes from Bashkir languages and roughly translates to the cave that swallowed a stream, which should give you some idea of what you're dealing with here. This isn't a gentle, tourist-friendly cavern with handrails and gift shops. This is a 3-level vertical labyrinth that plunges deep into the earth like something out of a geological fever dream. The entrance to Sumgan Kutuk is the stuff of adventure novels and mild nightmares. Picture a rectangular shaft, almost perfectly geometric, dropping straight down into darkness for about 116 meters. That's roughly the height of a 35-story building, except instead of an elevator, you have a rope and your own questionable life choices. The shaft is so perfectly rectangular that it almost looks artificial, as if some ancient civilization carved it deliberately. But no, this is purely the work of water and time, two forces that apparently have a very specific aesthetic vision when they work together. Once you've made it down the main shaft, assuming you've survived both the physical descent and the existential crisis that comes with dangling on a rope in absolute darkness, the cave opens up into a complex network of passages spanning 3 distinct levels. The upper level is relatively dry and features massive chambers decorated with stalactites and stalagmites that have been growing undisturbed for longer than humans have existed. The middle level is where things get interesting, with underground streams and pools of water so still they create perfect mirror reflections of the cave formations above. And the lower level? That's where the cave gets genuinely hostile, with flooded passages and underground rivers that have claimed the lives of more than a few explorers who underestimated just how seriously this cave takes its privacy. The total explored length of Sumgan Kutuk exceeds 9 kilometers, but cavers believe there's significantly more cave system waiting to be discovered. New passages are found regularly, often requiring specialized equipment and techniques that would make most people's insurance companies very nervous. The temperature inside remains constant year-round at about 4 degrees Celsius, which sounds tolerable until you realize you're wet, exhausted, and several hundred meters below the surface with no quick way out. Hypothermia isn't just a risk here. It's practically an inevitability for anyone who doesn't know exactly what they're doing. What makes Sumgan Kutuk particularly fascinating from a scientific perspective is its role as a time capsule for regional climate history. The cave formations, particularly the stalactites and stalagmites, contain chemical signatures that researchers can analyze to reconstruct what the climate was like thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years ago. Each layer of mineral deposit is like a page in a book written by the Earth itself, recording rainfall patterns, temperature changes, and atmospheric conditions that existed long before anyone was around to complain about the weather. It's essentially a geological library, except the books are made of rock, and the reading requires a mass spectrometer. Now, if you thought caves were just about impressive sizes and underground rivers, allow me to introduce you to the Waitomo glowworm caves in New Zealand, where the concept of stargazing takes on an entirely new meaning. These caves are home to a species of fungus gnat larvae, Arachnocampa luminosa, if you want to impress someone at a party, that produces bioluminescent light. Millions of these tiny creatures cling to the cave ceiling and glow with a soft blue light that looks exactly like a starry night sky. Except you're underground, it's actually daytime outside, and those stars are essentially hungry larvae trying to attract prey with their glowing butts. Romance is dead, apparently, but it's been replaced by something arguably more interesting. The glowworms create silk threads that hang down from the ceiling like fishing lines, because that's essentially what they are. Small insects flying through the cave are attracted to the light, get tangled in the sticky threads, and become dinner. It's a hunting strategy that's brutal, efficient, and absolutely beautiful to witness, which is a combination you don't often get in nature. Tour boats float silently through the caves, while visitors stare upward at what looks like the Milky Way. Except this galaxy is made of bioluminescent insect larvae. And honestly, that's kind of more impressive when you think about it. Speaking of underground spectacles that seem to defy physics, let's talk about the marble caves of Chile. Located on General Carrera Lake, one of the deepest lakes in the Americas, these caves have been sculpted by wave action over approximately 6,000 years. The result is a network of caverns, columns, and tunnels made entirely of marble so pure and so intricately carved by water that the whole place looks like it was designed by an architect who had unlimited budget and zero deadlines. The water in the lake is fed by glacial melt, which gives it an intense turquoise color that reflects off the swirling patterns in the marble walls. Depending on the season and water level, the caves glow in shades of blue, green, and silver that shift and change as you move through them. It's the kind of place that makes you question whether you've accidentally stumbled into a screensaver or a heavily filtered Instagram post. Except it's real, it exists, and the only filter is millions of years of patient geological work. The caves are only accessible by boat, and only when the weather cooperates, which in Patagonia means you should probably make backup plans. The region is famous for unpredictable weather that can shift from clear skies to horizontal rain in the time it takes to finish a sentence. But for those who make it, the experience is unlike anything else on the planet. You're floating through solid rock that has been transformed into something that looks soft and fluid, carved into curves and spirals by nothing more than water and time. It's a reminder that even the hardest substances on Earth can be reshaped by persistent, patient forces. But perhaps no cave captures the sheer alien strangeness of underground worlds quite like the Cave of Crystals in Mexico. Located beneath the Nica mine in Chihuahua, this cave contains some of the largest natural crystals ever discovered on Earth. We're talking about selenite crystals, a form of gypsum, that reach lengths of 11 meters and weigh up to 50 tons each. These aren't cute little crystals you'd find in a New Age shop. These are geological formations the size of telephone poles, and walking among them feels less like spelunking and more like shrinking down and wandering through your grandmother's chandelier. The catch, because there's always a catch when something is this spectacular, is that the Cave of Crystals is essentially inhospitable to human life. The temperature inside hovers around 58 degrees Celsius, with humidity approaching 100%. Without specialized cooling suits, a human being can survive in these conditions for roughly 10 minutes before their body starts shutting down. The heat and moisture are actually what allowed these crystals to grow so large. The cave was flooded with mineral-rich water heated by volcanic activity below, creating perfect conditions for crystal formation over approximately 500,000 years. When the mine pumped out the water to access ore deposits, they accidentally revealed this geological treasure that had been growing in secret longer than our species has existed. Scientists who study the cave have to wear suits filled with ice and breathe through cooled respirators. Their time inside is strictly limited, and every expedition is a race against the clock to collect data before the environment becomes genuinely dangerous. It's one of the most hostile places on Earth that humans can actually enter, which is both a testament to our scientific curiosity and a reminder that some places really weren't designed with visitors in mind. The Nica mine has since allowed the cave to refill with water, which means the crystal chamber is once again inaccessible, and the crystals are once again growing. In another few 100,000 years, they'll be even larger, though presumably none of us will be around to appreciate the growth spurt. It's humbling to realize that some of Earth's most spectacular features operate on timescales that make human civilization look like a brief afternoon nap. Underground worlds exist on every continent, in every climate, and at every scale imaginable. From the ice caves of Austria, where frozen waterfalls create sculptures that change shape with the seasons, to the lava tubes of Hawaii, formed by rivers of molten rock that drained away and left hollow tunnels behind. The underworld is far more varied and strange than most people ever realize. There are caves filled with thousands of bats, caves decorated with ancient human handprints, caves that serve as natural cathedrals with acoustics so perfect that concerts are held inside them. Each one is a reminder that beneath the surface we walk on every day, there's an entire hidden dimension waiting to be explored. The explorers who venture into these places are a particular breed of adventurer, part scientist, part athlete, and part something that's probably not entirely healthy from a psychological standpoint. Cave exploration requires navigating tight passages where getting stuck is a real possibility, swimming through underground rivers with no guarantee of where they lead, and spending hours or even days in complete darkness where your only light source is whatever you brought with you. The appeal is hard to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it, but there's something profoundly compelling about being one of the first humans to see a chamber that has existed in darkness for millions of years. It's the closest most of us will ever come to being genuine explorers, discovering territories that no map has ever recorded. These underground labyrinths remind us that our planet still holds mysteries, still has secrets to reveal, and still has the power to surprise us no matter how much we think we've figured out. The surface world is impressive, certainly, but it's really just the cover of the book. The real story is written in the darkness below, in passages carved by water that hasn't seen sunlight since before dinosaurs walked the earth, in formations that grow one drop at a time over timescales we can barely comprehend. So the next time you're walking across solid ground, remember, there might be an entire world beneath your feet, just waiting for someone curious enough to look. So we've established that Earth has been hiding entire worlds beneath our feet. But the planet's creative streak doesn't stop at underground labyrinths. No, our geological home has also decided to completely ignore the basic rules of physics we all learned in school. You know, the ones about how fire and ice don't really hang out together, how deserts and glaciers are supposed to be on opposite ends of the climate spectrum, and how certain combinations of elements should be physically impossible. Well, Earth clearly didn't get that memo. Or, more likely, it got the memo and used it as kindling for one of its eternal flames. Let's start with a mountain in Turkey that has been on fire for at least 2,000 years. Mount Chimera, known locally as Yanartus, which literally translates to burning rock, features flames that emerge directly from the mountainside and have been burning continuously since before the Roman Empire reached its peak. We're not talking about some recent geological phenomenon that scientists discovered last Tuesday. Ancient Greek and Roman sailors used these flames as a natural lighthouse to navigate the Mediterranean coast. Homer possibly referenced this exact location when writing about the fire-breathing monster Chimera in his mythology. Though to be fair, when you see flames shooting out of solid rock with no apparent fuel source, fire-breathing monster is actually a pretty reasonable explanation for people who didn't have access to Wikipedia. The science behind Yanartus is almost as wild as the mythology. Deep beneath the mountain, geological processes produce methane gas that seeps up through cracks in the rock. When this methane reaches the surface and meets oxygen, it ignites, and because the gas keeps flowing, the fire keeps burning. Simple enough in theory, except that the specific chemical reactions happening here are unlike anything else on the planet. Researchers have discovered that the rocks themselves are producing methane through a process called serpentinization, where certain minerals react with water at relatively low temperatures to generate hydrocarbon gases. This isn't supposed to happen at these temperatures and pressures, which means Mount Chimera is essentially breaking the rules of chemistry while casually maintaining a 2,000-year-old fire. No big deal. The flames themselves are scattered across the mountainside, like nature's eternal campfire collection. Some are small enough to roast marshmallows over, which tourists absolutely do, by the way, because humans will turn anything into a photo opportunity. Others are large enough to be visible from miles away, especially at night, when the entire hillside looks like it's hosting the world's longest-running outdoor barbecue. The ancient Lycians built a temple here dedicated to Hephaestus, the Greek god of fire and metalworking, which makes perfect sense. If you're looking for a place to worship the god of flames, you might as well choose the location where the earth itself provides the eternal torch. No maintenance required, no electricity bills, just pure geological pyrotechnics. But here's where things get even more interesting. The flames of Yanartus have been studied extensively, and scientists still can't fully explain all the reactions taking place. The gas composition is unique, containing not just methane but also hydrogen and other compounds that shouldn't be present in these quantities. Some researchers believe this site could provide insights into how hydrocarbons form on other planets, making this burning mountainside in Turkey potentially relevant to the search for life elsewhere in the solar system. Not bad for a tourist attraction where people come to cook sausages over ancient flame. Now, if eternal fire seems like it belongs on the extreme end of the natural spectrum, let's swing to the opposite side and visit a place where ice dominates everything, but in a way that's just as dramatically impossible as those Turkish flames. The Ostfjørður ice cap sits on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, closer to the North Pole than to mainland Europe, and it's one of the largest ice masses in the Arctic outside of Greenland. But Ostfjørður isn't just a big chunk of frozen water. It's a dynamic, moving, and occasionally terrifying demonstration of what happens when ice meets warming temperatures. During the summer months, meltwater accumulates on the surface of the glacier and begins searching for a way down. It finds cracks, crevasses, and weak points in the ice, carving channels that eventually reach the edge of the ice cap. And when they reach that edge, the water doesn't politely trickle into the sea. It cascades off the glacier face in massive waterfalls that plunge directly into the Arctic Ocean, creating a spectacle that looks like someone installed a water park attraction on the edge of an ice sheet. Except this water park is surrounded by polar bears, the water is barely above freezing, and the attraction is actually a visible sign of climate change in action. So, mixed feelings about the whole thing. The waterfalls of Ostfana are temporary phenomena, appearing during the melt season and disappearing when temperatures drop again. But while they exist, they're among the most dramatic displays of water behavior on the planet. Some of these falls drop hundreds of meters from the glacier surface to the ocean below, carving through ice that's been frozen for centuries. The sound is reportedly deafening, a constant roar of falling water echoing off the ice cliffs, punctuated by the occasional crack of calving ice as chunks of the glacier break away and crash into the sea. It's beautiful, it's terrifying. And it's a reminder that even the most seemingly permanent landscapes are constantly in motion. What makes Ostfana particularly significant is its role as a climate indicator. Ice caps like this one are essentially frozen records of atmospheric history, with layers of ice containing bubbles of ancient air that scientists can analyze to understand past climates. But they're also extremely sensitive to temperature changes, and Ostfana has been losing mass at an accelerating rate over the past few decades. The waterfalls that make for such dramatic photographs are, in a very real sense, the glacier bleeding out. Each drop of meltwater represents ice that took centuries to accumulate and seconds to lose. It's the kind of beauty that comes with a built-in existential crisis, which is becoming increasingly common in nature documentaries these days. But if you want to see fire and ice coexisting in a single landscape, neither Yanardus nor Ostfana can match the sheer visual absurdity of the Sarfaranga Cold Desert in Pakistan. This is a place that looks like someone took a Photoshop file, accidentally merged two completely different landscape layers, and then decided to keep it because the result was too interesting to delete. Golden sand dunes, the kind you'd expect to find in the Sahara, sit directly at the base of the Karakoram mountain range, with snow-capped peaks rising dramatically in the background. Sand and ice, desert and glacier, all sharing the same view like neighbors who have absolutely nothing in common, but somehow ended up on the same block. The Sarfaranga Desert exists because of the unique geography of the region. The Karakoram Mountains create a rain shadow effect, blocking moisture from reaching certain valleys and creating arid conditions at incredibly high altitudes. The result is a cold desert, an environment where precipitation is minimal, but temperatures can plunge well below freezing. The sand dunes have formed from sediment deposited by ancient rivers and blown by persistent winds, accumulating into formations that wouldn't look out of place in Arabia. Except you can see glaciers from where you're standing, and if you climb those dunes, you might need a jacket because it's actually quite cold up there. The visual contrast is genuinely disorienting. Your brain expects certain things to go together: palm trees with tropical beaches, sand dunes with scorching heat, snow-capped mountains with alpine meadows. Sarfaranga violates all these expectations simultaneously. You can stand on golden sand, feel a cold wind blowing down from glaciers, and watch as the late afternoon sun paints the Karakoram peaks in shades of pink and orange, while the desert below remains in shadow. It's the kind of place that makes landscape photographers weep with joy, and geography teachers question their entire curriculum. Speaking of things that shouldn't exist but somehow do, let's talk about water that glows. Not water with lights installed underneath, not water reflecting city lights, but actual bodies of water that generate their own illumination, like nature decided to install mood lighting in the ocean. Because apparently, regular water was too boring, and Earth needed to add some special effects to certain locations just to keep things interesting. The phenomenon is called bioluminescence, and while the science behind it is well understood, the experience of seeing it firsthand is nothing short of magical. Certain organisms, primarily dinoflagellates, a type of single-celled plankton, produce light through chemical reactions in their cells. When these organisms are disturbed, they flash with a blue or green glow that can turn entire coastlines into something that looks like a science fiction movie set. It's completely natural, entirely biological, and absolutely stunning in a way that photographs never quite capture. One of the most famous locations for this phenomenon is the Matsu Islands near Taiwan, particularly during the season locals call the Blue Tears. From April through September, the waters around these islands can erupt with bioluminescent displays, so intense that the coastline appears to be glowing from within. Every wave that breaks on shore leaves behind a trail of blue light. Every splash, every footstep in the shallow water, every fish swimming past triggers a cascade of luminescence that spreads outward like ripples of pure light. Walking along the beach at night feels like stepping through a portal into another dimension, where the laws of physics have been replaced with the laws of fantasy. The organisms responsible for the blue tears are Noctiluca scintillans, dinoflagellates that accumulate in massive concentrations when conditions are right. Warm water, abundant nutrients, and minimal wave action allow these creatures to multiply into the billions, creating blooms so dense that the water can appear milky during the day. But at night, when mechanical disturbance triggers their bioluminescent response, the same waters transform into a light show that puts most fireworks displays to shame. The glow can be bright enough to read by if you are inclined to bring a book to the beach at midnight, which honestly sounds like a pretty solid evening plan. The experience has become so popular that the Matsu Islands now host annual Blue Tears festivals, timing visits to coincide with peak bioluminescence season. Tour operators take visitors out in kayaks and small boats, where every paddle stroke leaves a glowing trail in the water. Some beaches allow visitors to wade into the shallows and watch as each movement creates expanding rings of blue light around their legs. It's interactive nature at its most spectacular. You're not just observing the phenomenon, you're triggering it, becoming part of the light show simply by existing in the water. But bioluminescent waters aren't limited to one location. The Mosquito Bay in Puerto Rico regularly ranks as one of the brightest bioluminescent bays in the world, with concentrations of dinoflagellates reaching up to 700,000 organisms per liter of water. That's roughly the population of a mid-sized city packed into every gallon of seawater, all of them ready to flash blue at the slightest disturbance. Swimming in Mosquito Bay at night, which, despite the name, is actually a pleasant experience, means being surrounded by light that responds to your every movement. Reach out your hand, and your fingers trail glowing threads through the water. Kick your feet, and you leave behind a constellation that slowly fades back into darkness. The science behind bioluminescence is fascinating in its own right. The organisms produce light through a reaction between a molecule called luciferin and an enzyme called luciferase, releasing energy in the form of photons rather than heat. It's an incredibly efficient process. Nearly 100% of the energy goes into producing light, compared to incandescent bulbs that waste most of their energy as heat. Evolution figured out LED technology hundreds of millions of years before humans even existed, which is either humbling or annoying depending on your perspective. Now, if glowing water represents nature's light show, then crystal clear water represents nature's magic trick. There are places on Earth where water becomes so transparent, so perfectly clear, that it essentially becomes invisible. Objects appear to float in midair. Boats seem to hover above the bottom, and your brain struggles to process what it's seeing because the visual information doesn't match your expectations of how water should look. One of the most striking examples is Blue Lake, or Goluboy Ozero, located in the Kabardino-Balkarian Republic of Russia. This small karst lake is fed by underground springs that filter the water through layers of limestone before it emerges into the basin. The filtration process removes virtually all particles, sediment, and organic matter, leaving behind water so pure that visibility can exceed 50 meters in optimal conditions. That's clearer than most swimming pools, clearer than most air in major cities, clearer than water has any reasonable right to be. The effect is genuinely disorienting. Looking into Blue Lake, you can see every detail of the bottom with perfect clarity. Rocks, underwater formations, the occasional fish going about its business as if unaware that it's become part of a natural optical illusion. Divers who explore the lake report a sensation of flying rather than swimming, their brains unable to reconcile the lack of visual distortion with the physical sensation of being underwater. It's like the water isn't there at all, except for the minor detail that you're completely submerged in it. Blue Lake is also unusual for its temperature and depth. Despite its relatively small surface area, the lake is estimated to be at least 250 meters deep, possibly more. The bottom has never been definitively reached. The water temperature remains constant year-round at around 9 degrees Celsius, fed by springs that maintain a steady flow regardless of surface conditions. This combination of extreme clarity, unknown depth, and constant temperature has made the lake both a research site for scientists and a destination for technical divers willing to brave the cold for the experience of swimming through what feels like liquid glass. Similar clarity can be found in various locations around the world, from the cenotes of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula to certain alpine lakes in New Zealand and Italy. Each of these bodies of water owes its transparency to specific geological conditions: limestone filtration, glacial melt, minimal organic activity, that combine to create something that shouldn't really exist but somehow does. They're reminders that water, the most common substance on Earth's surface, can still surprise us when the conditions are exactly right. These glowing and crystal-clear waters represent something important about our planet. They show that the natural world contains phenomena that seem almost designed to inspire wonder, as if Earth has an aesthetic sense and occasionally decides to show off. The bioluminescent bays didn't evolve for our entertainment. They're the result of ecological processes that have nothing to do with human appreciation. The clear lakes weren't filtered for our enjoyment. They're geological accidents that happen to produce beauty as a side effect. And yet here they are, waiting for anyone curious enough to seek them out, offering experiences that no human technology can replicate and no description can fully capture. Sometimes the best special effects are the ones that have been running for millions of years without any budget, any crew, or any post-production. Nature figured out how to be spectacular long before we figured out how to watch. We've explored underground labyrinths, watched fire and ice do their impossible dance, and witnessed water that generates its own light show. But Earth's creativity doesn't stop at caves and coastlines. Our planet has spent millions of years working on something even more ambitious, sculpting ordinary rock into formations so theatrical, so dramatically arranged, that they look like they were designed by the world's most patient architect with an unlimited budget and absolutely no deadline. Welcome to nature's amphitheaters, where the stage is made of stone and the performance has been running for longer than any civilization has existed. Let's start with Bryce Canyon in Utah, a place that looks like someone took a fantasy novel illustration and accidentally made it real. When you first see Bryce Canyon, your brain needs a moment to process what it's looking at. Thousands upon thousands of tall, thin rock spires called hoodoos rise from the canyon floor in densely packed clusters, painted in shades of red, orange, white, and pink that shift with the changing light. It looks less like a natural landscape and more like a massive chess set designed by a colorblind giant with very specific aesthetic preferences. Or perhaps a forest of stone trees planted by someone who fundamentally misunderstood how forests work. The Paiute people, who lived in this region long before European explorers showed up and started naming things, had their own explanation for the hoodoos. According to their legends, these formations were once the legend people, ancient beings who lived before humans and behaved so badly that Coyote, the trickster god, turned them all to stone as punishment. The different colors and shapes represent the various people frozen mid-action, still wearing whatever they had on when Coyote decided he'd had enough of their nonsense. It's a creation story that also functions as a morality tale, which is honestly pretty efficient storytelling. Behave yourself, or you might end up as a tourist attraction for the next several million years. The actual geological explanation is almost as interesting, though significantly less dramatic from a narrative standpoint. Bryce Canyon isn't technically a canyon at all. It's a series of natural amphitheaters carved into the edge of a plateau. The rock layers here were deposited over millions of years, creating alternating bands of limestone, siltstone, and mudstone with different levels of hardness. When water seeps into cracks and freezes, it expands and breaks the rock apart. When it rains, the softer layers erode faster than the harder layers. Over time, a lot of time, this differential erosion creates the distinctive hoodoo shapes, with harder rock caps protecting the softer material beneath like umbrellas made of stone. The process is still happening today. Bryce Canyon loses about 2 to 4 feet of rim every century, which sounds slow until you realize that means the formations you're looking at will be significantly different in a few thousand years. Some hoodoos are actively collapsing, others are being carved from the cliff face, and the whole landscape is essentially a work in progress that just happens to be progressing on a timescale that makes human lifespans look like brief interruptions. The hoodoos you see today didn't exist a million years ago, and the hoodoos that will exist a million years from now don't exist yet. You're visiting a temporary exhibition that just happens to be temporarily lasting longer than human civilization. The colors of Bryce Canyon deserve their own paragraph because they're genuinely ridiculous. The reds and oranges come from iron oxide, basically rust, mixed into the sediment. The purples appear where manganese is present. The whites represent the purest limestone, while the pinks are created by varying concentrations of iron. During sunrise and sunset, when the light hits at low angles, the entire amphitheater seems to glow from within, the colors intensifying to the point where photographs look oversaturated even when they're not edited at all. It's one of those places where reality genuinely looks better than any filter could make it, which is both wonderful and slightly annoying for anyone trying to prove they actually visited. Now, if Bryce Canyon represents nature's chaotic creativity, let's travel to Armenia to see what happens when geology decides to get organized. The Garni Gorge, located about 30 kilometers from the capital Yerevan, contains a formation so geometrically perfect that it looks like it was manufactured rather than formed. Locals call it the Symphony of Stones, and when you see it, you'll understand why. Thousands of basalt columns rise from the gorge walls in clusters that lean, fan out, and overlap like organ pipes in some massive geological cathedral. The symmetry is almost unsettling. Nature isn't supposed to produce shapes this regular, this precisely hexagonal, this obviously intentional looking. The columns formed around 50 to 60 million years ago when volcanic lava flowed into the gorge and began to cool. As basalt cools, it contracts, and because it's cooling from the outside in, the contraction creates stress patterns that naturally form hexagonal cracks, the most efficient way to relieve that stress evenly. It's the same principle that creates the hexagonal cells in a beehive, or the pattern of cracks in dried mud, or the shapes in a tortoise shell. The hexagon just happens to be nature's favorite shape when it comes to packing things efficiently, or relieving stress evenly, which is probably a metaphor for something, though I'm not sure what. What makes Garni special isn't just that these basalt columns exist. Similar formations can be found at Giant's Causeway in Ireland, Fingal's Cave in Scotland, and Devil's Postpile in California. It's the way they're arranged that creates the symphonic effect. Some columns stand perfectly vertical, like soldiers at attention. Others lean at angles, creating fan-shaped clusters that look like hands reaching out from the rock. Some curve outward from the cliff face in sweeping arcs that really do resemble the pipes of a massive pipe organ. The whole formation seems designed to produce music, as if you could strike the columns and hear notes resonating through the gorge. Visitors have tried this, by the way. The results are less symphonic than you might hope, but there's definitely a resonant quality to the sound of stone being struck in a natural amphitheater. The Azot River runs along the bottom of the gorge, adding moving water to the visual composition and creating a constant background soundtrack to complement the stone symphony above. The combination of ancient basalt columns, crystal clear river water, and the ruins of a Roman-era temple perched on the cliff above creates a landscape that feels deliberately composed, as if someone very talented spent a very long time getting everything exactly right. Except no one did. It's all geological accident, the result of processes that had no aesthetic intentions whatsoever, but somehow produced beauty anyway. For our final stone theater, let's travel to Argentina, to a place that looks like it belongs on another planet entirely. Ixigualasto, also known as Valle de la Luna, or Valley of the Moon, is a provincial park in San Juan province that earned its nickname for extremely obvious reasons. It genuinely looks like lunar terrain transplanted to Earth. The landscape is dominated by bizarre rock formations sculpted by wind erosion, with shapes so strange they've been given names like the mushroom, the sphinx, the submarine, and the bowling alley. Walking through Ixigualasto feels less like hiking and more like exploring a surrealist sculpture garden, where the artist was wind, water, and time. The formations here are made from sedimentary rocks deposited during the Triassic period, between approximately 230 and 200 million years ago. This was a time when dinosaurs were just getting started, when the supercontinent Pangaea was beginning to break apart, and when this particular region of South America was a lush river valley rather than the arid badlands it is today. The sediments that accumulated here eventually hardened into layers of claystone, sandstone, and volcanic ash, which then spent the next couple 100 million years being carved by erosion into the shapes you see today. The mushroom is probably the most photographed formation in the park, and for good reason. It looks exactly like its name suggests. A narrow neck of softer rock supports a wide cap of harder material, creating a shape that seems to defy physics and common sense. The cap should fall, your brain insists. The neck is too thin to support that weight. And yet there it stands, has stood for thousands of years and will continue to stand until erosion finally does what gravity has been suggesting all along. It's a reminder that impossible is often just improbable over human timescales, which is a distinction that matters when you're talking about geology. What makes Ixigualasto scientifically significant, beyond its aesthetic weirdness, is its paleontological treasure. The park contains one of the most complete records of Triassic life ever discovered, with fossils of some of the earliest dinosaurs, as well as the mammal ancestors and reptiles that shared their world. Walking through the Valley of the Moon, you're literally walking through a fossil graveyard of creatures that lived when dinosaurs were still the new kids on the evolutionary block. Some of the species found here exist nowhere else in the fossil record, making this barren lunar landscape one of the most important sites for understanding the early age of dinosaurs. Stone theaters are impressive, but they're also unmistakably geological. clearly the work of rock and erosion, and the kinds of slow processes that don't involve anything alive. But what about places where the ancient past is still growing, still breathing, still producing oxygen, and dropping leaves like nothing has changed in millions of years? Let's step into forests that remember the age of dinosaurs, ecosystems that have been running the same biological software since before humans existed, living time capsules that allow us to touch the deep past while it's still alive. On the island of Tenerife, in the Canary Islands, there's a forest that looks like it was imported from prehistoric Earth and somehow forgot to evolve. The Anaga Rural Park, located in the northeastern corner of the island, contains one of the largest surviving laurel forests in the world, a type of ecosystem that once covered much of southern Europe and North Africa during the Tertiary period, roughly 20 to 40 million years ago. When the climate changed and the Mediterranean region dried out, these forests disappeared from continental Europe. But the Canary Islands, with their stable temperatures, consistent moisture from trade winds, and isolated location, kept the conditions just right for the laurisilva to survive. Walking into the Anaga Forest is like walking into a nature documentary about deep time. The trees are laurel species that have barely changed since their ancestors provided shade for animals that went extinct before the first human ancestors climbed down from different trees. The understory is thick with ferns, mosses, and lichens that cling to every surface, creating a green palette that seems to absorb light itself. Mist drifts through the canopy constantly, condensing on leaves and dripping to the forest floor in a perpetual soft rain that keeps everything damp, everything green, everything exactly the way it's been for longer than any living thing can. Remember, the laurisilva ecosystem is self-sustaining in a way that most forests aren't. The trees don't just receive moisture from rain, they actually capture moisture directly from the clouds and fog that drift through the mountains. Their leaves are covered in tiny hairs that catch water droplets from the air, channeling them down to the roots and into the soil. During periods when it doesn't rain, the forest essentially drinks the clouds, extracting water from humidity with an efficiency that would make modern engineers jealous. It's a survival strategy that evolved millions of years ago and still works perfectly, which is either inspiring or a little embarrassing for our species depending on how you look at it. The biodiversity within Anaga is remarkable for such a small area. The isolation of the Canary Islands means that many species found here exist nowhere else on Earth. They evolved on these islands and never left, never could leave, and never needed to, because the conditions they required never changed. There are birds whose closest relatives live on other continents, plants that have been diverging from their mainland cousins for millions of years, and insects that have adapted specifically to the unique conditions of the laurel forest. Walking through Anaga isn't just walking through an old ecosystem. It's walking through a biological laboratory where evolution has been running independent experiments for geological timescales. The experience of visiting is difficult to describe without sounding like you've lost your grip on reality. The fog creates an atmosphere that shifts between mystical and slightly unnerving, with visibility changing from hundreds of meters to almost nothing as clouds drift through. Sounds are muffled by the thick vegetation and constant moisture, creating an acoustic environment that feels separated from the modern world. There are no traffic sounds, no aircraft noise, no human-generated background hum. Just bird calls, dripping water, and the occasional rustle of wind through leaves that look almost exactly like leaves have looked for 20 million years. If Anaga represents ancient forests preserved by isolation and climate stability, the Jawatan Forest in Indonesia represents something else entirely. An ecosystem that has been maintained by human activity, but looks like it stepped out of a fantasy novel. Located in Banyuwangi, East Java, this forest is dominated by massive tamarind trees, whose roots and trunks have been shaped over centuries into forms that seem deliberately artistic. Moss covers every surface, vines hang from branches in curtains of green, and the light filters through the canopy in shafts that move as clouds pass overhead, creating an ever-changing pattern of illumination and shadow. The tamarind trees of Jawatan are genuinely enormous. Some have trunks so thick that it would take several people with outstretched arms to encircle them. Their root systems are exposed and twisted, creating sculptural forms that look like they belong in the background of a Lord of the Rings sequence, rather than an Indonesian forest. The trees are draped in Spanish moss and other epiphytes, adding layers of texture that make each tree look ancient, wise, and possibly magical. It's the kind of forest where you wouldn't be surprised to encounter a wizard, a talking animal, or, at minimum, a very atmospheric music video being filmed. What's interesting about Jawatan is that it's not technically wild. The forest is located within a plantation managed by a state forestry company, and the trees were originally planted for timber production. But something about the combination of this particular species, this particular climate, and this particular soil created results that no one planned. The trees grew larger than expected, developed more dramatic shapes than expected, and accumulated more moss and atmospheric character than any timber plantation has a right to possess. Rather than harvest the trees, the company eventually realized they'd accidentally created a tourist attraction and pivoted accordingly. The result is a place that exists in an interesting space between natural and artificial, ancient and managed. The trees are old, but not ancient by geological standards, perhaps 100 to 200 years old, which makes them infants compared to the laurels of Anaga. But they've captured something that feels ancient, an aesthetic of deep time that resonates with human psychology in ways that younger, tidier forests don't. Walking through Jewatan activates the same sense of wonder that walking through any primeval forest would. Even though intellectually you know this particular forest is relatively recent and entirely planted. These forests, whether genuinely ancient like Anaga or artificially atmospheric like Jewatan, represent something important about our relationship with the deep past. They remind us that the world we live in is just one frame in a very long movie, that ecosystems and landscapes that seem permanent are actually temporary arrangements that just happen to be persisting during the brief window when humans exist. They're also reminders that beauty and wonder aren't always correlated with age or naturalness. Sometimes a planted forest can move us as deeply as one that survived the extinction of the dinosaurs. Because what matters isn't how something came to be, but what it makes us feel when we encounter it. Standing in these forests, breathing air filtered through leaves that evolved before our species existed, you can almost feel the weight of geological time pressing down on the present moment. These trees don't know that they're relics. They're just doing what they've always done. Growing, photosynthesizing, dropping leaves, responding to seasons, running the same biological programs they've been running since before anything called a human existed to observe them. And somehow, that unconscious persistence is more impressive than any intentional monument. These forests didn't try to survive for millions of years. They just did. We've wandered through underground labyrinths, watched fire dance on mountains and ice collapse into oceans, marveled at glowing waters and stone amphitheaters, and stepped through forests that remember the dinosaurs. But humans have always been drawn to places that feel somehow special, somehow charged with meaning beyond their physical characteristics. And throughout history, when people encountered landscapes that seemed to defy ordinary reality, they didn't just admire them. They built on them, prayed in them, and sometimes spent decades living in conditions that would make most of us file a complaint with whoever manages cosmic real estate. Let's start with a place that redefines what it means to seek solitude. In the country of Georgia, in the Imereti region, there stands a limestone pillar called Katski that rises 40 meters straight up from the valley floor, like a natural exclamation point. It's the kind of geological feature that makes you stop and stare, a single column of rock so dramatically isolated that it seems designed to make a statement. And at some point in the distant past, someone looked at this impossible spike of stone and thought, you know what that needs? A church on top, which is either the most profound spiritual insight in history or evidence that humans will build religious structures literally anywhere, including places that probably shouldn't have buildings at all. The first church on Katski Pillar was built sometime between the 6th and 8th centuries, which means people were climbing this 40-meter death trap with construction materials during an era when safety equipment meant hoping really hard that you wouldn't fall. Archaeologists have found evidence of a small chapel, hermit cells, a wine cellar, because apparently even medieval monks on top of impossible rock pillars needed their wine, and several graves. The site was used continuously until the Ottoman conquest of Georgia in the 15th century, when the pillar was abandoned and the buildings fell into ruin. For the next several hundred years, Katski sat there, slowly crumbling, while locals told stories about it but couldn't actually reach the top to verify what was up there. The pillar was finally scaled again in 1944 by a team of Georgian mountaineers who used modern climbing equipment to reach the summit. What they found was remarkable. The ruins of multiple structures, religious artifacts, and evidence of sustained habitation that must have required extraordinary dedication and an almost complete absence of fear of heights. The discovery sparked renewed interest in the site, and eventually, inevitably, someone decided that abandoning Katski to the elements wasn't acceptable when it could instead be reoccupied by someone willing to live in the most inconvenient location imaginable. Enter Maxim Kavtaradze, a Georgian monk who moved to the top of Kotsky Pillar in 1993 and proceeded to live there for approximately 20 years. 20 years, on top of a 40-meter rock pillar accessible only by ladder. His daily routine involved prayer, meditation, and presumably a lot of very careful movement, since one wrong step in the middle of the night would result in a very quick and very final descent. Supplies were delivered by a bucket system, visitors were rare by necessity, and the weather conditions ranged from uncomfortable to actively hostile, depending on the season. But Maxim wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for the kind of spiritual isolation that can only be achieved by physically removing yourself from the world in a way that makes casual visits basically impossible. The pillar now has a rebuilt chapel and a small dwelling, accessible by a metal ladder that replaced the original rope and wooden rungs. Maxim eventually descended due to age and health concerns, but the site remains active as a place of pilgrimage and prayer. Male visitors are occasionally permitted to climb. Women are not allowed on the pillar itself, which is frustrating from a modern perspective but consistent with certain Orthodox monastic traditions. And those who make the ascent report an experience that's equal parts terrifying and transcendent. Standing on top of Kotsky, surrounded by nothing but air on all sides, looking down at a world that seems impossibly far below, you can understand why someone might feel closer to the divine here. You can also understand why most people would prefer to feel closer to the divine somewhere with guardrails and a bathroom. Now, if Kotsky represents the extreme end of spiritual isolation, one person, one pillar, maximum inconvenience, let's travel to a place where spiritual architecture meets geopolitical complexity. The Diskit Monastery in Ladakh, India, sits in the Nubra Valley at an altitude of approximately 3,000 meters, overlooking the confluence of the Shiok and Nubra rivers. It's one of the oldest and largest Buddhist monasteries in the region, founded in the 14th century and still actively operating today. But what makes Diskit particularly striking isn't just its age or its location. It's the 32-meter statue of Maitreya Buddha that was installed in 2010, a golden figure that gazes out over the valley toward Pakistan and Tibet with an expression of serene compassion. The statue is enormous, visible from kilometers away, and positioned with what seems like deliberate symbolism. The Maitreya Buddha represents the future Buddha, the one who will appear when the teachings of the current Buddha have been forgotten and the world needs enlightenment again. Positioning this figure overlooking a valley that sits near the contested borders of three nuclear-armed nations, India, Pakistan, and China, sends a message about peace and hope that's either profoundly optimistic or slightly naive depending on your level of cynicism. Either way, it's hard to look at that golden face gazing toward some of the most militarized terrain on Earth and not feel something, even if that something is complicated. The monastery itself is a labyrinth of prayer halls, libraries, and residential quarters, built into the mountainside in the distinctive Tibetan Buddhist style. Whitewashed walls with dark window frames, prayer flags fluttering in the constant wind, and the sound of chanting monks create an atmosphere that feels removed from time as much as from geography. The monks here follow routines that have remained essentially unchanged for centuries, rising before dawn for prayers, studying Buddhist texts, performing rituals that connect them to a lineage stretching back over 2,000 years. The modern world exists. There's electricity now, and visitors arrive in tour buses, but it feels like an intrusion rather than the natural state of things. Getting to Diskit is an adventure in itself. The Nubra Valley is accessible via the Khardun La Pass, one of the highest motorable roads in the world at over 5,000 meters. The journey involves switchback roads carved into cliffs, altitude that makes breathing difficult, and scenery so dramatic it almost seems excessive. By the time you reach the monastery, you've already been through an experience that qualifies as a pilgrimage, even if you didn't intend it that way. The difficulty of access is part of the point. These places weren't meant to be convenient, weren't meant to be easy. The journey itself is supposed to transform you, so that by the time you arrive, you're ready to receive whatever the place has to offer. For our final sanctuary, let's return to Europe, to a place where the line between faith and engineering becomes genuinely difficult to locate. The Santuario Madonna della Corona, or Sanctuary of Our Lady of the Crown, is built into a sheer cliff face in the Italian Alps, 774 meters above the Adige Valley. When you first see it, your brain insists that something has gone wrong with your visual processing. Buildings aren't supposed to be there. There's no platform, no ledge, no obvious reason why anyone would think, Yes, this vertical rock face is exactly where we should put a church. And yet there it is, white walls and red roof emerging from the stone, as if the mountain grew it like a geological tumor with excellent architectural taste. The origins of the sanctuary date to the 15th century, when a statue of the Virgin Mary supposedly appeared miraculously in a small cave in the cliff face. Whether you believe in miraculous appearances or prefer to think that someone carried a statue up an extremely difficult route and left it there for reasons of their own, the result was the same. People started making pilgrimages to the site, and eventually someone decided that a proper church was needed. Building that church required techniques that would make modern construction crews nervous. Workers lowered themselves on ropes from above, carved ledges into the cliff face, and assembled the building piece by piece while dangling over a drop that would have ended any concerns about workplace safety violations permanently. The sanctuary has been expanded and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries, most recently in the 19th and 20th centuries, when access routes were improved and the structure was reinforced with modern materials. Today you can reach Madonna della Corona by a winding road that climbs the mountain from the village below, or by a footpath that includes a significant number of steps carved into the rock. Neither option is particularly easy, which is rather the point. Pilgrimage sites aren't supposed to have convenient parking and escalators. The effort required to reach them is supposed to be part of the spiritual practice, a physical demonstration of devotion that costs something and therefore means something. Inside, the sanctuary is surprisingly spacious, with a main church, several chapels, and the original cave where the statue was discovered, now incorporated into the structure. The views from the windows are vertigo-inducing, straight down the cliff face to the valley floor hundreds of meters below. Standing at those windows, looking out at the Alps stretching toward the horizon, you can understand why people have been drawn to this impossible location for centuries. It feels like standing at the edge of the world, at the boundary between the human realm and something larger. Whether that something is divine, geological, or simply the result of extremely committed medieval engineers depends on your worldview. But the effect is the same regardless. These sanctuaries, Katski, Diskit, Madonna della Corona, represent something fundamental about human psychology. We're drawn to edges, to boundaries, to places where the ordinary world seems to thin and something else becomes visible. We climb to impossible heights, build in impractical locations, and spend decades in solitude because something in us recognizes that the sacred often lives in places that are hard to reach. The difficulty is the point. The inconvenience is the message. These places say that some things are worth extraordinary effort, worth risk, worth discomfort. And whether you interpret that message religiously or simply as a statement about human ambition and creativity, the effect is profound. What's remarkable is that these sites continue to function as places of genuine devotion, not just tourist attractions. Monks still pray on Katski, still chant at Diskit, still conduct services at Madonna della Corona. The modern world has provided better access, ladders instead of ropes, roads instead of goat paths, electricity instead of candles. But it hasn't fundamentally changed what these places are for. They're still about transcendence, still about the human need to find meaning in locations that seem to touch something beyond ordinary experience. And in a world where everything is becoming more convenient, more accessible, more optimized for efficiency, there's something valuable about places that remain deliberately difficult, that insist on earning their wonder rather than giving it away for free. The pilgrims who climb to these sanctuaries today are doing something humans have done for millennia, seeking out the edges of the world, the places where reality seems to bend, where the vertical axis between earth and sky becomes tangible and traversable. They may arrive by car instead of on foot, may carry smartphones instead of staffs, but the fundamental impulse is the same. We want to touch the transcendent. We want to stand where heaven and earth seem to meet, and we're willing to climb very, very high to do it. We've climbed to spiritual sanctuaries perched between heaven and earth, where humans built impossible structures to touch the divine. But Earth doesn't need human construction to create landscapes that seem to belong to other worlds. Sometimes the planet just decides to repaint entire regions in colors that violate everything you thought you knew about how nature is supposed to look. Welcome to the Redlands, places where iron, minerals, and biology have conspired to create environments that look like someone went absolutely wild with the saturation slider and then refused to apologize for the results. Let's start with a beach that fundamentally misunderstands what beaches are supposed to look like. The Panjin Red Beach in northeastern China isn't red because of algae blooms or pollution or some industrial accident that local authorities are trying to spin as a feature rather than a bug. It's red because of a plant called Sueta salsa, a species of seepweed that has evolved to thrive in the alkaline, saline soil of the Liaohe River Delta. This plant starts its life green in spring, like any respectable piece of vegetation. But as summer transitions to autumn, it undergoes a color transformation so dramatic it makes New England fall foliage look like amateur hour. The entire coastal wetland turns a deep, vivid crimson that stretches to the horizon in every direction. We're talking about approximately 30 square kilometers of red. Not reddish, not kind of pinkish if you squint. Genuinely, unmistakably, almost aggressively red. The color is so intense that aerial photographs of Panjin look like they've been processed through every filter Instagram has ever invented. But they haven't. That's just what it looks like. The world's largest salt marsh decided that green was boring and chose violence instead, chromatically speaking. The Sueta salsa plant is what scientists call a halophyte, an organism adapted to survive in high-salt environments that would kill most other vegetation. The soil in the Liaohe Delta is so salty that conventional agriculture is basically impossible, which means humans left this area alone while they were busy cultivating every other useful piece of land in China. The Sueta didn't mind the salt at all. In fact, it thrived, spreading across the delta in dense mats that provide crucial habitat for migratory birds, including the endangered red-crowned crane and the black-beaked gull. The Red Beach isn't just visually spectacular. It's an important ecosystem that supports biodiversity precisely because it's too hostile for human agricultural interference. The best time to visit is September through October, when the color reaches its peak intensity before the plants begin to die back for winter. During this window, the contrast between the red vegetation, the blue sky, and the green reeds that grow in patches throughout the marsh creates a color palette that nature documentaries love and travel photographers consider basically unfair to everywhere else. Wooden boardwalks allow visitors to walk through the marsh without disturbing the ecosystem, floating above the crimson carpet like observers in some alien botanical garden. What's particularly interesting about Panjin is how recently it became a tourist destination. For most of human history, this was just a salt marsh, useful for the wildlife that lived there, interesting to the scientists who studied halophyte ecology, but not exactly a place anyone thought to visit for fun. The transformation into a major attraction happened in the 1990s and 2000s, as photography made the images available to a wider audience and tourism infrastructure made the site accessible. It's a reminder that spectacular natural phenomena can exist for millennia without being discovered in any meaningful sense. They're just waiting for someone to notice, to take a photograph, to say, "Hey, has anyone else seen this incredibly red beach in China?" Now, if Panjin represents biological color rebellion, let's look at a place where the red comes from geology rather than botany, and where the landscape is so Mars-like that scientists use it as a training ground for understanding the actual red planet. Ural Mars, located near the town of Bogatiri in Russia's Chelyabinsk region, is a former bauxite quarry that was abandoned in the 1990s when the ore deposits were exhausted. What the miners left behind was a landscape so otherworldly that it's become a destination for geology enthusiasts, photographers, and anyone who wants to pretend they've traveled to another planet without actually having to deal with spacecraft or the complete absence of breathable atmosphere. The soil here is genuinely intensely red, not the rusty orange red of some desert landscapes, but a deep crimson that comes from high concentrations of iron oxide in the bauxite residue. Bauxite is the primary ore of aluminum, but it also contains significant amounts of iron compounds that oxidize when exposed to air and water, producing the distinctive coloration. The quarrying process removed the topsoil and vegetation, exposing layers of mineral-rich earth that have been oxidizing for decades, intensifying the red color year after year. Walking through Ural Mars is a genuinely disorienting experience. The ground is red, the hills are red, the water in the small pools and streams is tinted with red sediment, and there's virtually no vegetation because the soil chemistry is too extreme for most plants to survive. Your brain keeps insisting that something is wrong, that landscapes aren't supposed to look like this, that you've somehow stepped through a portal to somewhere else entirely. The only things that break the monochrome are the occasional patches of blue sky reflected in standing water, and the distant green of the surrounding Russian countryside, visible from the higher viewpoints as a reminder that normal Earth still exists, somewhere beyond this crimson anomaly. Scientists have studied Ural-Mars as a terrestrial analog for Martian geology, using it to test instruments and techniques that might be used on actual Mars missions. The iron-rich soil, the lack of vegetation, and the extreme chemical conditions make it one of the closest approximations to the Martian surface available without leaving Earth. Researchers from various institutions have collected samples here, run experiments on oxidation processes, and used the site to calibrate remote sensing equipment. It's basically a practice Mars, which is either a testament to human ingenuity or evidence that will turn literally anything into a research opportunity if we can justify the grant funding. The site has become increasingly popular with tourists in recent years, though popular is relative. We're talking about a former industrial site in the Russian interior, not exactly a convenient weekend destination for most of the world's population. But for those who make the journey, the experience is unlike anything else. Standing in the middle of Ural-Mars, surrounded by red terrain in every direction, it's easy to forget that you're on Earth at all. The silence, the alien coloration, the absence of familiar landmarks, it all combines to create a sense of displacement that's both unsettling and oddly peaceful. You're nowhere you recognize, which means you're also nowhere you need to be anything other than present. For our final red landscape, let's travel to Madagascar, an island so biologically unique that it basically functions as a separate planet anyway. The Tsingy Rouge, located in the northern part of the island near Diego Suarez, is a formation of red sandstone pinnacles that looks like someone built a forest out of solidified flames. The word Tsingy comes from the Malagasy language and roughly translates to where one cannot walk barefoot, which is accurate. These formations are sharp, unstable, and not remotely interested in accommodating human feet. The Tsingy Rouge is much smaller than Madagascar's famous gray limestone Tsingy formations, but what it lacks in scale it makes up for in chromatic intensity. The sandstone here is rich in iron oxide, giving it a deep red color that intensifies dramatically at sunrise and sunset when the low-angle light hits the formation. The pinnacles range from a few meters to perhaps 15 meters tall, clustered together in arrangements that look like the skyline of some miniature alien city or the set design for a particularly ambitious fantasy film. What makes the Tsingy Rouge particularly fascinating is how temporary it is. These formations are being actively eroded by wind and rain, their shapes changing noticeably from year to year. The soft sandstone that gives them their color also makes them vulnerable to weathering, which means the landscape you see today won't be the landscape someone sees in a decade. Some pinnacles are collapsing, others are being carved into new shapes, and the whole formation is essentially a work in progress that happens to be progressing toward eventual dissolution. It's beautiful precisely because it's fragile. Spectacular precisely because it won't last. The formation process is the inverse of the gray Tsingy, which are created by acidic rainwater dissolving limestone over millions of years. The Tsingy Rouge formed when softer sediments were eroded away, leaving the harder sandstone layers standing as isolated pinnacles. Rain channels cut vertical grooves into the formations. Wind sculpts horizontal bands, and the whole thing slowly disintegrates while simultaneously creating new shapes. It's a landscape in constant conversation with the elements, being destroyed and created simultaneously. Visiting the Tsingy Rouge requires navigating roads that range from challenging to technically impassable during rainy season, which is fairly standard for Madagascar. The island's infrastructure hasn't quite caught up with its tourism potential, which means that getting to many of its most spectacular locations involves adventures that weren't necessarily planned. But the difficulty of access has also protected places like the Tsingy Rouge from over-tourism. There are no hotels here, no restaurants, no souvenir shops selling miniature red pinnacles. Just the formations themselves, changing a little bit every day, waiting for whoever is curious enough to make the journey. These redlands, Pangin, Ural-Mars, Tsingy Rouge, share something beyond their coloration. They're all places where Earth has stepped outside its usual palette, or the assumptions we carry about what landscapes should look like get challenged and overturned. We expect beaches to be yellow or white, expect soil to be brown or black, expect rock formations to be gray or tan. When we encounter places that violate these expectations, something in our brains lights up with a combination of confusion and delight. We're seeing something that shouldn't exist, except it does, and the dissonance between expectation and reality creates a form of wonder that's difficult to access any other way. The color red carries its own psychological weight, of course. It's the color of blood and fire, of warning signs and stoplights, of passion and danger. Landscapes painted in red feel inherently dramatic, inherently significant, as if the Earth itself is trying to communicate something urgent. Whether that communication is about iron chemistry, or halophyte biology, or sandstone erosion, doesn't really matter in the moment of experience. What matters is the visceral impact of standing in a world that looks like it's been dipped in pigment, saturated beyond what nature usually allows. These places also remind us that color itself is something of an illusion, a product of how our eyes and brains interpret electromagnetic radiation bouncing off surfaces. The red we see at Panjin is chlorophyll breaking down and anthocyanins becoming visible. The red at Ural Mars is iron atoms bonding with oxygen in particular crystalline arrangements. The red at Cingi Rouge is the same iron chemistry locked in sedimentary stone. None of these surfaces are actually red in any fundamental sense. They just happen to reflect wavelengths in the range we've categorized as red. And our visual systems render that reflection as a color that carries all the emotional associations we've built up over millennia of evolution and culture. But knowing the science doesn't diminish the wonder. If anything, understanding why these places look the way they do makes them more impressive, not less. The Sueda at Panjin isn't just turning red. It's engaging in sophisticated photochemistry to protect itself from seasonal stress. The soil at Ural Mars isn't just oxidized. It's a window into the processes that painted an entire planet the same color. The pinnacles at Cingi Rouge aren't just eroding. They're demonstrating the ongoing negotiation between rock and atmosphere that shapes every landscape on Earth. The redlands aren't violations of natural law at all. They're expressions of it, just in a vocabulary we don't encounter every day. We've walked through landscapes painted in impossible reds, where Earth seems to be auditioning for a role as Mars. But our planet's creative ambitions don't stop at the shoreline. Out in the ocean, far from the continents where most humans live their lives, there are islands that operate by their own rules. Places so isolated, so unique, that they might as well be separate planets floating in a sea of salt water rather than space. Welcome to the realm of Mirage Islands, where evolution experiments without supervision, where geological processes happen on human timescales, and where jellyfish have completely forgotten how to do the one thing jellyfish are supposed to do. Let's start with an island that didn't exist when your grandparents were born. Surtsey, located off the southern coast of Iceland, emerged from the Atlantic Ocean on November 14, 1963, when an underwater volcanic eruption broke the surface and began building land where there had been only waves. The fishermen who first spotted the plume of smoke and steam thought a ship was on fire. Reasonable assumption, honestly. Brand new island being born from the sea isn't usually on anyone's list of expected sightings during a routine fishing trip. But that's exactly what was happening. And over the next 3.5 years, the eruption would continue, eventually creating an island of about 2.7 square kilometers at its maximum extent. The name Surtsey comes from Surtur, a fire giant from Norse mythology, who will play a starring role in Ragnarok by setting the world on fire. The Icelanders, it turns out, have a flair for dramatic naming that matches their dramatically volcanic homeland. And this wasn't just any volcanic eruption. This was the birth of new land, which happens occasionally on the geological timescale, but almost never in ways that humans can actually witness from beginning to end. Scientists realized almost immediately that Surtsey represented an unprecedented opportunity. A completely sterile island, fresh from the Earth's interior, that could be studied as life gradually colonized it. They essentially got a blank laboratory notebook from nature and decided to fill it with the most detailed documentation of ecological succession ever attempted. The first life to arrive on Surtsey was, predictably, bacterial and fungal. Microscopic pioneers that don't require much in the way of welcome mats or established ecosystems. Then came the plants, carried by wind, waves, and the digestive systems of birds. Seeds that could survive floating across seawater or passing through a seagull's intestinal tract had a significant advantage in the colonization lottery. By the 1970s, mosses and lichens had established themselves on the cooling lava, followed by grasses and eventually small shrubs. Each new species was documented, cataloged, and celebrated by the researchers who had essentially adopted this infant island as their long-term science project. Access to Surtsey is extremely restricted. Only scientists with approved research projects are allowed to set foot on the island, and they follow strict protocols to avoid accidentally introducing species that might contaminate the natural experiment. This makes Surtsey one of the most exclusive destinations on Earth, not because of wealth or status requirements, but because of scientific purity standards. You can't buy a ticket to Surtsey no matter how rich you are. You can only earn one by having research questions that justify the risk of disturbing the world's most carefully monitored ecosystem. The birds, naturally, didn't get the memo about restricted access. Seabirds began nesting on Surtsey within a few years of its formation, and their presence has dramatically accelerated the development of soil and vegetation. Bird droppings, to use the scientific term, guano, are rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, essentially fertilizing the volcanic rock and creating conditions where more demanding plants can grow. The areas around seabird colonies are now noticeably greener and more vegetated than the rest of the island, demonstrating in real time how biological activity shapes landscapes. The birds aren't just visiting. They're literally building the island's ecosystem, one dropping at a time, which is either poetic or disgusting depending on your perspective. Surtsey is also slowly disappearing. The soft volcanic material is constantly being eroded by waves, and the island has already lost about half its original area. Eventually, probably within a few hundred years, it will be reduced to a small remnant, or disappear entirely beneath the waves. This adds a certain urgency to the research. Scientists are studying a natural phenomenon that has a built-in expiration date, documenting processes that will run their course whether anyone is watching or not. Surtsey is a temporary island teaching permanent lessons about how life colonizes new territory, and the classroom won't be available forever. Now, if Surtsey represents islands as scientific laboratories, let's visit a place where islands have become something closer to a fantastical aquarium. The Rock Islands of Palau, located in the western Pacific Ocean, are one of the most visually distinctive island groups on Earth. Over 300 limestone islands rise from the lagoon, their bases undercut by millennia of wave action until they resemble giant mushrooms sprouting from the turquoise water. The islands are uninhabited, too small for permanent settlement, too steep for practical use. But they create a seascape so surreal that photographs of Palau regularly get accused of being digitally manipulated. They're not. That's just what it looks like. The mushroom shape is the result of biological as well as physical erosion. The limestone at water level is constantly being attacked by marine organisms, mollusks, sea urchins, various boring creatures that spend their lives drilling into rock, while the upper portions remain protected. Over thousands of years, this differential erosion carves the distinctive undercut profiles that make the rock islands look like they're floating rather than connected to the seafloor. The islands are covered with dense vegetation that has never been cleared, creating a continuous green canopy that contrasts dramatically with the blue lagoon below. But the Rock Island's most famous feature isn't visible from the surface at all. Tucked away in the interior of one of these limestone islands is Ongimult Ketau, better known to tourists as Jellyfish Lake. This marine lake was once connected to the ocean, but geological changes isolated it thousands of years ago, trapping a population of jellyfish inside. Cut off from their ocean relatives and their natural predators, these jellyfish underwent an evolutionary transformation that has made them one of the most unusual creatures in any body of water anywhere on Earth. The golden jellyfish of Jellyfish Lake have essentially lost their sting. Their nematocysts, the specialized cells that deliver venom in other jellyfish species, have atrophied to the point of being effectively useless against anything larger than the microscopic zooplankton they feed on. Humans can swim among millions of these jellyfish without experiencing anything more than a gentle brushing sensation as the creatures pulse past. It's the jellyfish equivalent of a dog losing its bite, except in this case the adaptation makes perfect sense. In an isolated lake with no significant predators, maintaining expensive defensive weaponry is an evolutionary waste of resources. The jellyfish follow the sun across the lake throughout the day, swimming from the western shore to the eastern shore as the sun tracks overhead. This migration isn't random. The jellyfish host symbiotic algae in their tissues that require sunlight to photosynthesize, providing nutrition that supplements what the jellyfish can catch on their own. By following the sun, they're essentially farming their internal gardens, positioning themselves for maximum light exposure like tiny floating greenhouses with tentacles. The daily migration creates shifting clouds of golden bodies that move across the lake in predictable patterns, a natural spectacle that has made Jellyfish Lake one of Palau's most popular tourist destinations. Swimming in Jellyfish Lake is an experience that defies easy description. You're surrounded by creatures that your instincts insist should be dangerous, except they're not. They bump against you gently, their bells pulsing with what looks like deliberate rhythm, their trailing tentacles brushing past without consequence. The water is warm, the visibility is excellent, and the sensation is something like floating through a living lava lamp. It's peaceful in a way that feels almost medicinal, as if the act of being surrounded by harmless jellyfish somehow resets something in your nervous system that modern life has made too alert. The lake has faced challenges in recent years. A severe El Niño event in 2016 killed most of the jellyfish population by raising water temperatures and disrupting the food web. The lake was closed to tourists for 2 years while the ecosystem recovered, and the experience served as a reminder that even isolated environments are connected to global systems. The jellyfish have since rebounded, their numbers returning to pre-crash levels, but the episode demonstrated how fragile these unique ecosystems can be. What took thousands of years to evolve can be disrupted in months by conditions created halfway around the world. For our final island realm, let's travel to New Caledonia, a French territory in the southwestern Pacific that contains one of the largest lagoons on Earth and one of the most biologically diverse marine environments anywhere. The New Caledonian Lagoon stretches over 24,000 square kilometers, protected by a barrier reef that's second in length only to Australia's Great Barrier Reef. Within this vast enclosed space, an estimated 9,000 species of marine life have been documented, with new species being discovered regularly. It's essentially an ocean within an ocean, a protected marine universe that has been evolving in relative isolation for millions of years. The reef system around New Caledonia is ancient and complex, with sections dating back at least 20 million years. This longevity has allowed extraordinary diversity to develop. The lagoon contains over 350 species of coral alone, along with sea turtles, dugongs, sharks, rays, and fish species that exist nowhere else. The combination of tropical conditions, isolation, and geological stability has created a marine biodiversity hotspot that rivals anywhere on the planet, all wrapped around a single island chain that most people have never heard of. New Caledonia itself is unusual for a Pacific island. Unlike most of its neighbors, which are volcanic or coral-based, New Caledonia contains ancient continental crust, a fragment of Gondwana, the supercontinent that broke apart over 100 million years ago. This geological heritage gives the main island, Grande Terre, soil chemistry and biodiversity patterns that are unique in the Pacific. The island hosts numerous endemic species, including the kagu, a flightless bird that looks like it was designed by a committee that couldn't agree on what birds should look like, and the world's richest diversity of conifer species per unit area. The intersection of marine and terrestrial uniqueness makes New Caledonia one of the most scientifically valuable places on Earth, and it has been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site for both its lagoon and its terrestrial ecosystems. But it's also a place that demonstrates the challenges of protecting natural heritage in the modern world. Mining interests, development pressure, and climate change all threaten the ecosystems that make New Caledonia special. The same nickel deposits that make the territory economically valuable also create pressures that could damage the biological diversity that makes it irreplaceable. These island realms, Surtsey, the Rock Islands, New Caledonia, represent different aspects of what makes islands so fascinating to scientists and travelers alike. Surtsey shows us how ecosystems begin, how life colonizes sterile rock and builds complexity from nothing. The Rock Islands show us how isolation transforms species, how creatures cut off from their relatives can evolve in directions that would be impossible in connected environments. New Caledonia shows us what happens when isolation persists for millions of years, creating biodiversity that can't be replicated or replaced once lost. Islands have always captured human imagination because they represent possibility. They're finite, comprehensible, separate from the overwhelming complexity of continents. An island can be mapped, understood, possessed in ways that larger landmasses cannot. But they also represent fragility. An island ecosystem can be destroyed completely in ways that continental ecosystems cannot, because there's nowhere for displaced species to retreat, no backup populations waiting to recolonize. The same isolation that creates uniqueness also creates vulnerability. Perhaps that's why these mirage islands feel so precious. They're reminders that Earth is still capable of surprise, still generating new lands and new species, and new combinations of life that didn't exist before. They're also reminders that what exists can disappear. Surtsey eroding into the sea, Jellyfish Lake threatened by climate fluctuations, New Caledonia's reefs stressed by warming waters. These aren't permanent features of the planet but temporary arrangements, beautiful exactly because they won't last forever. The ocean that created them can also reclaim them, and what seems eternal on human timescales is merely a moment on geological ones. Standing on any of these islands, or swimming in their waters in the case of Jellyfish Lake, you're experiencing something that millions of years of isolation created, and that changing conditions might eventually undo. The trick is to appreciate the wonder while it exists, to recognize that temporary doesn't mean less valuable, and to remember that the ocean is full of places we haven't discovered yet, islands that haven't emerged yet, species that haven't evolved yet. The Mirage Islands we know are just the ones we've found so far. We've drifted through island realms where jellyfish forgot how to sting and new lands emerge from the sea. But if you want to witness Earth at its most dramatically theatrical, you need to go where the planet is actively building and destroying itself, where molten rock meets the surface, where craters become stages for geological performances that have been running since before anything with eyes existed to watch. Welcome to the volcanic arenas, nature's coliseums where the shows never end, and the special effects budget is essentially unlimited. Let's start with a place that sounds like it was designed by a committee of fantasy novelists who couldn't agree on anything except that it should be maximally dramatic. The Bromo Tengger Semeru National Park in East Java, Indonesia, is the only place on Earth where multiple active volcanoes are visible simultaneously within a single massive caldera. It's like someone created a volcanic theme park and then forgot to add the safety railings, the gift shops, and any sense of reasonable proportion. The caldera itself, the Tengger caldera, is approximately 10 kilometers across, a massive bowl created by an ancient volcanic explosion that makes modern eruptions look like party poppers. Inside this bowl sits the Sand Sea, a vast expanse of volcanic ash and sand that looks like a desert transplanted to the wrong location. And rising from this otherworldly plain are several volcanic cones, including Mount Bromo, which is still actively smoking like it's trying to quit but hasn't quite committed yet. In the distance, looming over everything, is Mount Semeru, the highest volcano in Java and one of the most active in Indonesia, regularly producing eruptions that remind everyone that this landscape isn't a museum exhibit, but a work in progress. The experience most visitors come for happens at sunrise, and it's worth the brutal early morning wake-up call. Before dawn, tourists and photographers gather on the rim of the caldera at viewpoints like Mount Penanjakan, shivering in the unexpected cold. Yes, it gets cold in tropical Indonesia when you're at 2,000 meters elevation, and waiting for the light show to begin. As the sun rises, its rays illuminate the volcanic plain below, while the cold air keeps clouds trapped in the caldera at a lower elevation. The result is what locals call the Sea of Clouds, a layer of white mist filling the caldera like milk in a bowl, with the volcanic peaks emerging as islands in this ethereal ocean. The effect is genuinely surreal. You're standing above the clouds, watching them slowly burn off as the sun rises, while active volcanoes smoke in the middle distance, and the highest peak in Java catches the first golden light of morning. It's the kind of scene that makes atheists reconsider their positions, and makes photographers accidentally fill their entire memory card before realizing the best lighting hasn't even happened yet. The Sea of Clouds shifts and flows, revealing and concealing features of the landscape in ways that seem almost choreographed, except no one is in charge here. This is just what happens when geography and meteorology and geology combine in exactly the right way. The Tenggerese people have lived in this region for centuries, maintaining a Hindu culture and traditions while the rest of Java became predominantly Muslim. They hold an annual ceremony called Yadnya Kasada, during which offerings are thrown into Mount Bromo's crater to appease the volcano god and ensure prosperity. It's a reminder that humans have been negotiating with volcanoes since long before we understood the science behind them. When your neighbor is a mountain that occasionally explodes, diplomacy seems like a reasonable approach, regardless of whether the mountain is technically listening. Now, if Bromo represents volcanic drama on a massive scale, let's travel to a different part of Java to see what happens when volcanic chemistry gets creative with color. Kawah Putih, or White Crater, is located in the highlands south of Bandung, and it contains a lake that can't seem to decide what color it wants to be. Depending on when you visit, the water might be turquoise, pale green, or an almost ghostly white, changes that can happen over the course of hours rather than seasons. The lake sits in the crater of Mount Patuha, a volcano that last erupted in the 12th century but still maintains enough geothermal activity to keep things interesting. The water is highly acidic. We're talking about a pH around 0.5 to 1.3, which is roughly equivalent to battery acid, and saturated with sulfur compounds that create the distinctive coloration. When conditions change, temperature fluctuations, variations in gas emissions, shifts in water chemistry, the sulfur compounds react differently, producing the dramatic color changes that make Kawah Putih such a popular destination for visitors who, like their lakes, unpredictable. The crater itself has an otherworldly quality that extends beyond the water. Dead trees stand bleached white by the acidic environment, their branches reaching upward like skeletal hands. The surrounding rocks are stained in shades of white, yellow, and pale green by centuries of mineral deposits. The air smells strongly of sulfur, the classic rotten eggs aroma that signals volcanic activity, and signs warn visitors not to stay too long in areas where gas concentrations might be dangerous. It's beautiful, but it's also a reminder that volcanic landscapes are not designed with human comfort in mind. The lake doesn't care about your Instagram aesthetic. It's busy being a pool of naturally occurring acid that happens to look pretty while being completely lethal to swim in. The color changes at Kawah Putih have become something of a social media phenomenon, with visitors comparing photographs taken hours apart and marveling at the differences. Some people have reported watching the colors shift in real time during their visit, which either makes them incredibly lucky or incredibly good at self-deception. It's hard to tell with volcanochemistry. The point is that this is a landscape where nothing stays the same, where the visual experience depends on factors beyond anyone's control, and where coming back a second time guarantees you'll see something different. For our final volcanic arena, let's visit a geothermal system so young that it's basically a newborn in geological terms. The Waimangu Volcanic Rift Valley in New Zealand is approximately 140 years old, not ancient even by human standards, much less geological ones, and it's still figuring out what it wants to be when it grows up. The system was created by the 1886 eruption of Mount Tarawera, one of the most destructive volcanic events in New Zealand's recorded history, and it has been evolving continuously ever since. The Tarawera eruption buried several Maori villages and killed an estimated 120 people, making it a tragedy as well as a geological event. But in the aftermath, something remarkable emerged. The rift created by the eruption filled with geothermal features, hot springs, geysers, fumaroles, and crater lakes that developed from scratch in the years following the disaster. Scientists have been watching these features appear, grow, change, and sometimes disappear ever since, making Waimangu one of the most closely monitored geothermal systems on the planet. What makes Waimangu particularly fascinating is how actively it changes. Water levels in the crater lakes rise and fall in cycles that have been measured for over a century, the system essentially breathing as geothermal pressures build and release. Some features that existed in the early 20th century have since vanished, while others have appeared where there was nothing before. The Waimangu Geyser, which was once the largest geyser in the world, erupting to heights of over 400 meters, stopped functioning in 1904 when a change in the local hydrology altered the underground plumbing. It's as if the system is experimenting with different configurations, trying out various combinations of heat, water, and pressure to see what works. The colors at Waimangu are spectacular in their own right. Inferno Crater Lake is a vivid turquoise blue, heated to temperatures between 50 and 80 degrees Celsius, depending on the cycle it's in. Frying Pan Lake is the world's largest hot spring, covering nearly 4 hectares and maintaining an average temperature of around 55 degrees Celsius. The colors come from dissolved minerals, suspended silica, and the way geothermal fluids interact with surface water. A different palette than Kawah Putih, but equally dramatic, equally unpredictable, equally dependent on processes happening far beneath the visible surface. Volcanic landscapes wear their drama on their surface. Smoking craters, color-changing lakes, seas of clouds at sunrise. But some of Earth's most spectacular places save their surprises for specific moments, lying dormant for months or even years before suddenly revealing what they're capable of. Let's talk about deserts that aren't what they seem. Landscapes that look lifeless until conditions align and they explode with evidence that life has been waiting just below the surface all along. Namakwaland, stretching across the northwestern corner of South Africa and into southern Namibia, is one of the most dramatic examples of botanical patience on the planet. For most of the year, this region looks exactly like what you'd expect from semi-arid terrain. Rocky, brown, sparse vegetation, the kind of landscape that makes you reach for your water bottle just looking at photographs of it. Hardy succulents cling to existence, a few thorny shrubs dot the hillsides, and the overall impression is of a land that life has mostly given up on. Tourists who visit in the wrong season come away wondering what all the fuss is about. But then the rains come. In good years, between July and September, winter rainfall triggers one of the most spectacular wildflower displays anywhere on Earth. Within weeks, sometimes within days, the barren landscape transforms into a carpet of color so intense it can be seen from space. Millions upon millions of daisies, lilies, and other flowering plants that have been waiting as seeds or bulbs beneath the soil suddenly erupt into bloom, covering the hillsides in sheets of orange, yellow, purple, and white. It's like someone pressed a button and activated a hidden program that had been dormant all along, which is actually a pretty accurate description of what happens biologically. The plants of Namaqualand have evolved specifically for this boom and bust lifestyle. They complete their entire above-ground life cycle in the few weeks when conditions are favorable, producing flowers, attracting pollinators, setting seed, and dying back to wait for the next favorable period. Some of these seeds can survive in the soil for years or even decades, waiting for exactly the right combination of rainfall and temperature to trigger germination. It's not that the desert is empty between bloom seasons. It's that most of the life is invisible, stored as genetic potential rather than visible biomass. The flower season attracts tourists from around the world, turning small towns like Springbok and Nieuwoutville into temporary destinations for botanical pilgrims. Local farmers have learned to supplement their income by allowing visitors onto their land during peak bloom, which is a nice example of ecosystem services generating actual income. But the flowers don't perform on schedule. Years with poor rainfall produce disappointing displays, while exceptional years create scenes that exceed anything photographs can capture. Visiting Namaqualand during flower season is a gamble. You might see the display of a lifetime, or you might see a slightly greener version of the usual arid landscape. The biodiversity here is staggering once you start paying attention. Namaqualand is part of the succulent Karoo biome, which contains the highest concentration of succulent plant species anywhere on Earth. Over 6,000 species, most of them found nowhere else. The annual flowers get the headlines and the tourist attention, but the real botanical treasure is in the perennial succulents that survive year-round. Each species adapted to its particular microhabitat, its particular soil type, its particular relationship with fog and dew and the occasional rain. The desert that looks empty is actually incredibly full. You just have to know how to see it. Now, let's travel to a place where deserts are genuinely unexpected. Japan, a country famous for green mountains, cherry blossoms, and rainfall that keeps everything lush. The Tottori Sand Dunes, located on the coast of Tottori Prefecture facing the Sea of Japan, are the largest sand dunes in the country, and arguably the most incongruous landscape in a nation that doesn't seem designed for this sort of thing. Golden Sand stretches for approximately 2.5 kilometers along the coast and extends up to 2 kilometers inland, reaching heights of over 50 meters in some places. It looks like someone accidentally imported a piece of the Sahara and installed it in the wrong continent. The dunes formed over tens of thousands of years as sediment from the Sendai River accumulated along the coast and was reshaped by wind. The same winds that bring moisture to most of Japan apparently decided this particular stretch of coastline should have a different experience, creating an arid microclimate that supports dune formation rather than the usual dense vegetation. The result is a landscape so unusual for Japan that it has become a major tourist attraction, drawing over 2 million visitors annually who come to see what a desert looks like when it's surrounded by a country that usually can't stop growing things. What makes Tottori particularly fascinating is how actively the dunes change. Unlike some desert landscapes that remain more or less stable over human timescales, the Tottori dunes are constantly being reshaped by wind. Patterns that exist in the morning may be completely different by evening. Wind ripples form, migrate, and disappear. Larger formations called star dunes and Barken dunes shift position over days and weeks. The landscape is essentially a living sculpture that rearranges itself continuously, never quite the same twice, always responding to the most recent weather conditions. Ironically, the dunes face a threat that would be welcome in most deserts: vegetation encroachment. Without active management, plants would gradually colonize the sand and the dunes would stabilize into ordinary coastal landscape. Local authorities have had to implement programs to remove vegetation and maintain the bare sand that makes the dunes distinctive. It's a strange form of conservation, protecting a desert from becoming a forest. But it reflects the fact that natural doesn't always mean static, and sometimes preserving a landscape requires active intervention against natural processes. For our final deceptive desert, let's visit Fuerteventura, the second largest of Spain's Canary Islands, and a place that has mastered the art of looking like somewhere else entirely. Located just over 100 kilometers off the coast of Morocco, Fuerteventura is technically not a desert at all. It's a volcanic island with enough rainfall to support some vegetation and enough coastline to host significant tourism. But step away from the beaches and into the interior, and you'll find landscapes that look indistinguishable from the Sahara. The illusion is so convincing that Fuerteventura has been used as a filming location for movies set in desert environments. Why transport an entire crew to North Africa when you can achieve the same visual effect on a European island with comfortable hotels and reliable infrastructure? The ochre plains, the volcanic soil, the stark mountain profiles against clear blue skies. All of it combines to create a desert aesthetic that photographs beautifully and requires no imagination to believe. The geology behind Fuerteventura's desert appearance is volcanic rather than the sedimentary processes that create continental deserts. The island is one of the oldest in the Canary Archipelago, and millions of years of erosion have worn down its volcanic peaks into relatively gentle terrain. The reddish-brown coloration comes from oxidized volcanic rock, the same iron chemistry we saw in the Redlands chapter, while the sparse vegetation reflects rainfall patterns that favor the northern islands of the chain over this relatively southern location. What makes Fuerteventura interesting from a biological perspective is the contradiction between appearance and reality. Despite looking lifeless, the island supports numerous endemic species, plants and animals that exist here and nowhere else, adapted to the specific conditions of this particular volcanic environment. The Egyptian vulture maintains a population here, as do several species of reptiles found on no other Canary island. The apparent desert is actually an ecosystem, just one that operates at a lower intensity than we expect from green landscapes. These deceptive deserts teach us something important about how we perceive landscapes. We tend to judge vitality by greenness, productivity by density, value by obvious activity. But ecosystems don't work according to human aesthetic preferences. Namaqualand is most alive when it looks most empty, its biological potential stored and visible in the soil. Totori is most dynamic when it appears most barren, its surface constantly rearranged by forces we can't see. Fuerteventura is most biodiverse when it looks most hostile, its endemic species thriving in niches that seem impossible. The desert that looks dead is often just waiting for rain, for the right season, for conditions that activate what has been dormant all along. Patience, it turns out, is not just a human virtue, it's an evolutionary strategy. We've traveled a long way together, from underground labyrinths where jungles grow in eternal darkness, to volcanic arenas where the planet demonstrates its power in real time. From waters that glow like someone left the cosmic nightlight on, to deserts that play dead for months before exploding with impossible color. We've visited stone amphitheaters carved by nothing more than patience and weather, forests that remember when dinosaurs were the dominant life form, and islands that didn't exist until our grandparents were already adults. We've climbed to sanctuaries perched between heaven and earth, walked through landscapes painted in colors that violate everything we thought we knew about how nature works, and floated among jellyfish that forgot how to sting because evolution decided venom was too much trouble for their particular situation. But here's the thing, and this is where I need you to really pay attention. None of these places are just tourist destinations. They're not attractions designed for our entertainment, not stage sets constructed to provide Instagram content, not geological amusement parks waiting for visitors to appreciate them. Every single location we've explored is a message from Earth itself, a communication in a language we're only beginning to understand. Think about what it takes to create a cave like Sondung. Millions of years of water seeping through limestone, drop by patient drop, dissolving rock and carrying it away, grain by grain. The collapse that created the skylights happened on a timescale that makes human history look like a brief interruption in a very long movie. The jungle that now grows inside required seeds to travel on wind and water, and through the digestive systems of birds, each species taking root and building soil where none existed, creating an ecosystem from scratch in a location that seems designed to reject life entirely. The cave doesn't know it's spectacular. It's just the result of processes that have been running for longer than anything with consciousness has existed to observe them. The same is true for every place we've visited. The eternal flames of Mount Chimera don't burn for our benefit. They're the result of chemical reactions that would continue whether anyone was watching or not. The hoodoos of Bryce Canyon aren't posing for photographs. They're being eroded into non-existence at a rate that will eventually reduce them to dust, regardless of how many tourists come to admire them. The bioluminescent waters of Matsu don't glow to create magical experiences for swimmers. The organisms responsible are just trying to eat and avoid being eaten, and the light is a byproduct of their survival strategies. We're not the audience for these performances. We're just lucky enough to have stumbled into theaters where shows have been running for geological ages. This matters because it changes how we think about our relationship with these places. They don't need us. They existed before humans evolved, they'll exist after humans are gone, and our presence is essentially irrelevant to the processes that created them. The mountain that has been on fire for 2,000 years doesn't care that we've named it, or built temples to it, or take photographs of its flames. The crystal caves of Mexico weren't waiting for someone to discover them. They were growing in perfect darkness for 500,000 years, completely indifferent to whether anyone ever saw them. We are guests in these places, not owners, and the difference matters more than most of us realize. But here's what's complicated. Even though these places don't need us, many of them are now vulnerable to us in ways they've never been vulnerable before. The very characteristics that make them spectacular, their isolation, their unique conditions, their dependence on specific environmental parameters, also make them fragile in the face of human activity. Climate change is bleaching coral reefs and melting glaciers. Tourism pressure is damaging ecosystems that evolved without human presence. Pollution is reaching places that seemed impossibly remote. The jellyfish of Palau nearly went extinct because of temperature changes caused by events on the other side of the planet. The eternal flames of Chimera will continue burning regardless of what we do, but the ecosystems around them are far less resilient. This isn't a guilt trip, or at least, not entirely. It's just important to understand that wonder comes with responsibility. The privilege of witnessing these places carries an obligation to think about their futures, not just our experience of their present. Some of these locations are already protected, managed by governments or international bodies that recognize their irreplaceable value. Others exist in legal gray zones, visited by increasing numbers of tourists without clear plans for sustainability. Still others remain almost unknown, their protection coming from obscurity rather than policy. The places we've explored also teach us something about time that's easy to forget in our world of instant gratification and quarterly reports. The hoodoos of Bryce Canyon have been forming for 60 million years and will be gone in another few million. The forests of Anaga have been growing since before the Mediterranean dried up, maintaining biological communities that survived extinctions that wiped out most of their relatives. The geothermal system at Waimangu is 140 years old, practically newborn by geological standards, and it's still figuring out its configuration, still experimenting with different arrangements of heat and water and pressure. These timescales are humbling in a way that nothing else can match. Our individual lives are so brief in comparison that they barely register on the same graph. But here's where it gets interesting. Even though we're temporary, and these places are ancient, we're the first species in Earth's 4.5 billion year history that can actually appreciate them. Dinosaurs walked past the developing formations of what would become Bryce Canyon without any capacity to register their beauty. The bacteria that colonized Surtsey in its first years had no awareness of participating in a scientific experiment. The jellyfish of Palau have been following the sun across their lake for 12,000 years without understanding why they do it or marveling at the circumstances that created their unique existence. We're the first observers, the first beings that can look at a glowing bay or a stone amphitheater or an eternal flame and feel something in response. Wonder, curiosity, aesthetic appreciation, spiritual awe. That capacity for wonder is worth protecting, not just for its own sake, but because it connects us to something larger than our daily concerns. The problems we face as individuals and as a species are real and pressing, but they're not the whole story. There's a world out there that has been creating beauty and spectacle for billions of years, completely independent of human needs or desires, and we have the opportunity to witness it. That opportunity is a gift, one that most living things never receive, and treating it with appropriate gratitude seems like the minimum reasonable response. So what do we do with all this? How do we translate wonder into action, appreciation into responsibility? The answers aren't complicated, even if they're not always easy. Support conservation efforts for places that matter to you. Think about the impact of your travel choices, not to stop traveling, but to travel thoughtfully. Pay attention to the scientific research that helps us understand these places and the policy decisions that affect their futures. Share what you've learned with people who might not otherwise encounter it. The more people who understand what exists and why it matters, the better the chances that it will continue to exist. And maybe most importantly, remember that the places we've talked about are just a fraction of what's out there. Earth is still full of locations that most people have never heard of, phenomena that haven't been documented on YouTube, ecosystems that haven't been photographed for Instagram. The planet's capacity for surprise isn't exhausted. It's barely been tapped. Every year, scientists discover new caves, new species, new geological formations that expand our understanding of what's possible. The world is bigger and stranger and more wonderful than any single video can capture. And that's actually great news. It means there's always more to explore, always more to learn, always more reason to stay curious. We started this journey with a promise that there are places on Earth that most people have never seen. Places that look like they were designed by someone with unlimited imagination and zero concern for plausibility. I hope we've delivered on that promise. From the jungles growing inside Vietnamese caves to the red beaches of China, from the crystal formations of Mexico to the breathing geothermal systems of New Zealand, we've visited a planet that continuously exceeds expectations and defies categorization. These places exist right now, on the same Earth where you're watching this video, subject to the same physics and chemistry and biology that govern your own existence. They're not fantasy. They're not digital creations. They're real. And knowing they're real changes something about how the world feels. The French philosopher Albert Camus once wrote that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, that even in the face of absurd eternal struggle, there's meaning to be found in the effort itself. I think something similar applies to our relationship with Earth's hidden wonders. We know that geological time will eventually erase everything we've seen. The hoodoos will collapse, the islands will erode, the caves will fill with sediment, the volcanoes will go quiet. Entropy wins in the end, as it always does. But right now, in this particular moment of cosmic history, these places exist, and we can witness them. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who appreciates a good journey through the impossible corners of our planet. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future explorations. Trust me, we've barely scratched the surface of what Earth has been hiding from us. Leave a comment telling me which of these places blew your mind the most, or if you've actually visited any of them and can confirm they're as ridiculous in person as they sound in description. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the world is still full of wonder, despite everything. And maybe, just maybe, start planning a trip to see one of these places for yourself. Not because the places need you, they don't, but because you might need them. The message Earth is sending isn't complicated. There's more here than you imagine, more variety than you expect, more beauty than you deserve. The planet has been experimenting with form and color and process for billions of years, and we get to see the results. That's the inheritance we've received by virtue of being conscious beings on this particular rock at this particular time. What we do with that inheritance, whether we protect it, destroy it, ignore it, or celebrate it, is up to us. Thanks for watching. Thanks for staying curious, and I'll see you in the next exploration of the impossible places hiding in plain sight on our endlessly surprising planet. Until then, remember, the most incredible things often exist where no one thinks to look. Go look anyway.